Hello and welcome to this week's 52 Weeks. This week we're continuing in Chapter 8, Economic Development, with another segment on the priorities for the city. Within the Economic Development chapter, there are recommendations for the city to look at three main priorities. This is in priority number 1, the maintenance industry, which we looked at in the previous segment. Priority number 2, the strengthening of the transportation hub. And priority 3, expand Harrisburg's private business sector. This week we're going to be looking at priority number 2, strengthen the transportation hub. This segment takes a step back into history. A look back to the 1974 General Plan again proves prescient and instructive. It calls for the implementation of, quote, a balanced transportation system which, among other things, will be adequate to foreseeable demand and will reduce social and economic cost placed in the city, its downtown, and its neighborhoods by undue reliance on private automobiles. Again, this is going back to 1974. So as we look into the comprehensive plan, there's some drawing on these previous plans which were never implemented. So we think about how do we strengthen that. Quote from the comp plan, with 44% of adults in the city not owning automobiles, the demand is clear for convenient alternative transportation options, providing personal mobility within the city and throughout the region. One important difference between 1974 and 2016 is the emergence of transportation alternatives such as car and bike share programs, on-demand transportation, and soon the likelihood of an on-demand self-driving cars in the near future. As we think about Harrisburg as being a transportation hub, we must zoom back out to the regional mass transit and transit-oriented development. PennDOT has invested substantially in improvements to its Keystone Corridor service. As a result, Harrisburg enjoys frequent, fast, and direct train service to Philadelphia and New York. This looks back to Chapter 6, Mobility and Access, to identify necessary enhancement to last-mile mobility options when continuing on local transportation options after arrival in Harrisburg. With a direct rail link in place for convenient transportation to and from the airport and center city, we'll have a complete network of alternative transportation. Goal 8.6, Harrisburg's role as the transportation hub. Quote, Harrisburg is the core community for 1.7 million people. As we zoom out, we need to be thinking about this. Continuing on, the transportation system should reflect this structure, strengthening the hub and spoke system centered on the Harrisburg Transportation Center. And here's a map from the Pennsylvania Railroad looking at how that railroad was the structure for all movement around the state within the late 19th century and the early to mid 20th century. Adjacent to the Harrisburg Transportation Center, a carefully planned transit-oriented development would emerge as the most convenient business and residential location for the region. Currently, what we have is a fragmented transportation system supporting a cluster of relatively uncompetitive townships, boroughs, and cities. And I would argue they're actually competitive in trying to draw resources from each other. Continuing with the objective 8.6.1, develop an area-wide advanced multimodal public transportation plan. This just makes sense in developing how this is all connected. The plan anticipates the positive effect of the disruptive nature of new transportation technologies with driverless cars on increased demand public transportation services. This is reflected in a call for the focused development around the transportation center and community commercial nodes. So we did this way back in 2016, 2017. This needs to have more focused as this plan is developed and then getting into implementation. So how should we be looking at this transportation hub? Central Pennsylvania is a web of smaller communities. Tri-County Planning's origin-destination study shows significant difference in the locations where regional residents live and work. CREDIC representatives noted an example of strong labor pool in Harrisburg and corresponding jobs in Silver Springs and Middlesex townships. This begs a critical look at the recurrent failure of the city and region to implement the 1974 General Plan recommendations. As we go through this process of this comprehensive plan, it is good to remember some of the history and that some of this stuff is not new. This was on the books. It just didn't get implemented for whatever reason. So we can call into account all of the things that never got done and take the time now to critically think about how do we put this into a plan as well as mission and vision to get this done for the next 2 decades. We owe it to the next generation to provide this legacy. This is the failure of the previous generations in doing it. Something was dropped and it never got implemented. So we cannot repeat those same mistakes. Looking back at the 1974 General Plan recommendations, the area-wide long-range mass transit plan being conducted as a component of the Harrisburg Area Transportation Study, that's HATS, in addition to holding the promise of providing for true balance in Harrisburg's transportation system, the completion of this study will necessitate an overall reevaluation of the HATS highway plan. Again, this is going back to 1974. Continuing with the recommendation, the failure of the regional governments to collaborate to create convenient regional public transportation is the single most damaging oversight in our economic regional structure. So we can go back to figure out why was this never implemented. So if there were any good reporters out there, this would be good to dig up and review of why this was never implemented. And we could continue to be critical here as we turn into the next decade, but really we cannot repeat the same mistakes that were done, 40 years ago. The way we get around this is by triple bottom line thinking in people, place, and economics. We need to look at the interrelationships of these things and how it affects our economic development, the placemaking, as well as developing people in our region. So how do we continue to build on some of the 1974 recommendations? We can think about the bike routes, differentiating life in the regional hub with bikeways, redefining streets, creating value through the branding of streets, and really look at neighborhood cores and AB streets, and the latter which links the east and west beyond Cameron Street and the Paxton Creek waterway. Objective 8.6.2, implement the East Shore portions of the improved transit system as phase 1, leading by example to generate demand for the West Shore portion. This goes and looks at Corridor 1, or what's now called the Capitol Rose Corridor. Objective 8.6.3, establish the premier regional commercial core in the transit-oriented development area around the Harrisburg Transportation Center. There's a nice graphic here to look at some of the hotspots of cores within our neighborhoods, and this can come into play with small area plans that link back to the larger framework of the transportation hub. Objective 8.6.4, adapting city planning from personal car-centric planning practice to a focus on land uses accommodating multimodal transportation options. Again, reviewing the chart of who owns vehicles. 44% of driving age adults in the city do not own automobiles and rely on public transportation to traverse the city and the region. Moving into more finer details in the action items, Action 8.6.4.2, require new parking facilities to be underground, located away from primary streets. Action 8.6.4.3, require above-grade parking to be housed in sustainable structures, incorporating flat plate construction with a minimum of 13-foot floor-to-floor dimension. Such structures are convertible for use as commercial or residential structures. And as we come to some conclusion on this segment, the additional sidebars. Moving beyond car ownership, there are a number of strategies emerging across the country and the world which increase mobility and access opportunities without requiring car ownership. In fact, the current model of car ownership in the US will become outdated as more people shift to a subscription-based approach to vehicular access. Continuing on the moving beyond car ownership, newer models serving as a hybrid between private vehicles and transit, such as commuter van pools, can greatly expand affordable access to goods, services, employment, and education around our city and our region. Quote, in helping people get from public transit and activity centers within the city, these new transportation paradigms address first and last mile issues, making life easier for residents and visitors who do not have or cannot afford a car, and enables others the option of living car-free or car-light. Another sidebar to look at is the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. The Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge, the CVRR Bridge, is the crossing that links Harrisburg to Cumberland County on the west shore of the Susquehanna River. The bridge has sat unused for 30 plus years. Fairly recently, within this past decade, the previous ideas by CAT and the Modern Transit Partnership, or MTP, proposed a commuter rail connection, Corridor 1, Capitol Rose Corridor, between Lancaster, Harrisburg, and Carlisle via the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. However, the Harrisburg-Carlisle segment was dropped from the proposal, scuttling the entire project. This bridge has also been looked at as a rail-to-trail conversion to link both east and west. It's been talked about for a long time without any implementation. And lastly, the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. As the region continues to grow, there's a likely future function for this bridge as a mass transit corridor. The incorporation of pedestrian and bicycling infrastructure in the near term provide an alternative transit service that should be maintained in the future iteration of the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. So this wraps up this week's segment within Chapter 8, Economic Development, which focused on primary number 2, Harrisburg as a transportation hub. We hope this has been enjoyable and continue to look into the links to see some of the history of the 1974 General Plan as well as the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge for further information. Thanks again and take care.